"I built my life on one promise," Adrian Whitmore said, his voice low enough to quiet a ballroom full of people who had spent years waiting for him to slip. "Never love anyone." The crystal chandeliers above the Whitmore Foundation Gala still burned gold against the midnight glass of Manhattan, but the air had changed. Conversations died. Champagne flutes paused halfway to painted lips. Camera flashes slowed, then sharpened, as if even the room itself understood that men like Adrian did not confess things in public unless the confession was dangerous. At 38, he had everything America respected and envied. A penthouse overlooking Central Park, a financial empire spread across 3 continents, a last name that could move markets before the opening bell. He was the billionaire who never smiled too long, never drank too much, never stayed anywhere after the deal was done. On magazine covers, they called him disciplined. On cable news, they called him brilliant. In private, the people who worked closest to him used a simpler word: cold. Adrian did not correct them. Cold men survived. Cold men did not make promises they could not keep. And for 6 years, he had kept that one. He had turned down heirs to old money, women with perfect resumes, women with perfect faces, women who understood exactly how to stand beside power and look as if they belonged there. He had refused every headline, every rumor, every carefully arranged introduction. Love, to Adrian, was a poorly negotiated contract. It asked for everything and protected nothing. Then he looked across the ballroom, and the line of his jaw tightened with the kind of restraint that always meant he was losing a fight no one else could see. Naomi Carter stood near the back of the room in a black dress, so simple it made every diamond in the place look desperate. She was not trying to be the center of attention, which was exactly why attention found her anyway. One hand rested lightly over the stem of a water glass. The other held the edge of a silver program folded once, neatly, as if she had no intention of staying longer than courtesy required. She did not smile when their eyes met. She did not look away, either. That was the first thing Adrian had noticed about her 6 months earlier in a conference room on the 46th floor of Whitmore Holdings. Not her beauty, though no honest man would have missed it. Not the calm in her posture, though it was rare in rooms built to intimidate. It was the fact that she read silence correctly. Most people rushed to fill it. Naomi used it like a language. And yet, Adrian continued, every word now aimed at only one person in the room. There are promises a man keeps because he is proud, and promises he breaks because he finally meets the truth. A murmur moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the stage, a board member shifted in visible discomfort. Adrian ignored him. He had ignored half the room for years. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, he intended to ignore the rest of it too. Naomi's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not into softness, not yet, but into something more fragile and far more powerful: surprise. Because if there was one thing more impossible than Adrian Whitmore falling in love, it was Adrian Whitmore admitting it where the whole city could hear. He took one step down from the stage, then another, as if every polished inch of marble between them mattered. 6 months ago, he said, she walked into my office with a contract in her hand and looked at me like I was just a man. And just like that, the room disappeared, leaving only the memory of a spring afternoon, a stack of legal papers, and the woman who had entered his life as a clause and become the one exception to every rule he had ever written. 6 months earlier, rain pressed softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Holdings, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of silver and smoke. Adrian Whitmore stood at the head of the conference table while attorneys arranged folders in perfect rows, every page clipped, every signature line marked with discrete tabs. The board had given him 72 hours to solve a problem they had disguised as tradition. If he wanted full voting control before the merger closed, he needed to appear stable, rooted, untouchably respectable. In their world, a wife was still considered proof of permanence. Adrian thought the idea was outdated, insulting, and useful. He had already decided he would do it the way he did everything else. Efficiently, quietly, without emotion. Then the glass door opened, and Naomi Carter walked in 10 minutes early, carrying no visible nerves and no interest in impressing anyone. She wore a camel coat over a navy dress, the kind of polished simplicity that said she understood the room without dressing for its approval. One of the attorneys stood to greet her, but she did not rush forward with practiced warmth or social ambition. She took her seat, placed a leather folder on the table, and looked directly at Adrian. Not at his watch, not at the skyline behind him, not at the famous last name printed on the building entrance downstairs. At him. It was such a small thing, and yet it unsettled the rhythm of the room. "Miss Carter," one of the lawyers began, sliding the contract toward her. "This agreement outlines the public terms of the marriage arrangement, the duration, the appearance requirements, the residence expectations, and the financial." "I can read," Naomi said, not sharply, just clearly. The lawyer stopped. Adrian watched her open the document and move through it with the kind of focus he usually only saw in senior negotiators and federal regulators. No hesitation, no confusion, no theatrical offense, just careful attention. She read every clause, turned every page, marked 2 sections with a pen she had brought herself. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No one interrupted her. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm enough to make the attorneys uneasy. "Clause 7 is unacceptable," she said. Adrian glanced down. "Residence and access," he replied. "Standard language. Standard for people who confuse access with ownership," Naomi said. "If I sign this, I will attend the events, respect the timeline, and protect the public image attached to your family name. But I will not agree to be monitored, redirected, or managed as if I am another Whitmore asset." One of the attorneys shifted in his seat. Adrian did not. "What do you want changed?" he asked. Naomi slid the marked page across the table. "I want language that reflects dignity. Separate private discretion. Mutual consent for personal appearances beyond the agreed calendar. And one more thing." Adrian leaned back slightly. "Go on." "No one speaks to me," she said, her voice even, "as if money purchased the right to reduce me." Silence settled over the room. It was not dramatic. It was heavier than that. Adrian had expected resistance, perhaps nerves, perhaps carefully hidden ambition. He had not expected precision. He had not expected self-respect delivered without performance. For the first time that morning, the contract in front of him looked less like a solution and more like a test. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the Hudson. Inside, Adrian lowered his eyes to the revisions she had written in clean, steady handwriting. Then he did something his attorneys had almost never seen him do in a negotiation. He smiled, faintly once. "Amend it," he said. And when Naomi Carter met his gaze again, Adrian had the distinct and deeply inconvenient feeling that the most controlled decision of his life had just become the beginning of something he would not be able to control at all. The wedding lasted 14 minutes. That was how Adrian preferred it. No cathedral, no orchestra, no wandering relatives with opinions disguised as blessings. Just a private judge on the Upper East Side, 2 attorneys, 1 assistant with a document envelope, and a skyline beyond the windows that looked too distant to belong to anyone. Naomi arrived exactly on time in an ivory suit instead of a gown, and Adrian noticed that choice before he noticed anything else. It was elegant, restrained, and impossible to misread. She had not come to play a princess in someone else's arrangement. She had come to sign an agreement and keep her dignity intact while doing it. The ring he placed on her finger was a clean oval diamond in platinum, expensive enough to silence gossip before it started. Naomi accepted it with the same composure she had shown in the conference room, then slid a simple gold band onto his hand without letting her fingertips linger. They said the vows the law required. Nothing more. No promises about forever. No trembling confessions. No one kissed for the cameras because there were no cameras allowed. By noon, Adrian was back in a town car heading downtown for a merger briefing, and Naomi was in the passenger seat beside him reading a folder about the Whitmore Foundation as if the morning had been just another meeting. The penthouse waiting for them occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Central Park South, all stone, glass, pale oak, and views that cost more than most people earned in several lifetimes. It was quiet in the disciplined way only very expensive places could be quiet. Staff moved like they had been, trained by silence itself. A house manager named Evelyn showed Naomi through the residence, carefully explaining schedules, service entrances, and guest protocols, but Naomi only asked 2 questions. Where is the nearest private exit, and where can I make coffee without waking the whole floor? Adrian heard about both from Evelyn before dinner, and found himself annoyed by how quickly Naomi was learning the architecture of a life she was supposed to occupy only temporarily. That first evening, they ate at opposite ends of a 12-seat dining table under a row of pendant lights that made everything look precise and slightly unreal. Adrian reviewed earnings projections between bites. Naomi read briefing notes for the charitable events she would be expected to attend as Mrs. Whitmore. Neither of them reached for conversation out of politeness. Neither pretended intimacy where none existed. It should have felt efficient. Instead, there was an awareness in the room that made efficiency difficult. "The west hallway leads to your rooms," Adrian said at last, setting down his glass of water. "Your office is being finished tomorrow. Security will give you direct access to the private elevator." Naomi nodded. "Thank you." That should have ended it. But she looked up from her papers and added, "For what it is worth, I do not intend to make this arrangement harder than it already is." Adrian held her gaze. "I do not need it to be easier." "No," she said softly. "You probably do not." Then she returned to reading, and somehow that quiet answer followed him long after dinner ended. The days that followed developed rules without needing to be spoken aloud. They appeared together when necessary and nowhere more than necessary. Breakfast was optional. Public events were mandatory. Personal questions were avoided. Adrian left before sunrise most mornings for Whitmore Holdings, where analysts, attorneys, and board members waited with problems large enough to distract any man from the condition of his home life. But distraction did not work the way it used to. By the end of the first week, he knew Naomi took her coffee black after 7 in the morning, but with cream if she had slept badly. He knew she stood by the east windows when she needed to think. He knew she never raised her voice with staff, which made people want to please her more, not less. And he knew that the apartment no longer felt as silent as it once had, even when neither of them was speaking. One Thursday night, he returned near 11 after 3 delayed meetings and found the penthouse lit only by the low lamps in the living room. Naomi sat curled into one corner of the long sofa, shoes off, reading with a cashmere throw over her knees and jazz playing softly from somewhere he could not immediately place. She looked up when he entered, neither startled nor overly familiar. "Just aware." "Long day?" she asked. Adrian loosened his tie. "They usually are." Naomi closed her book with one finger marking the page. "There is soup in the kitchen. Evelyn said you skipped lunch." It was such a simple sentence that it should not have mattered. No one in his world asked whether he had eaten unless there was an agenda attached. Adrian stood there for half a second too long, coat still on, the city burning beyond the glass behind him. "Thank you," he said. Naomi gave a small nod and opened her book again, offering him no performance of care, no demand for response. Just warmth placed quietly on the table and left there. Adrian turned toward the kitchen, but the truth followed him anyway. The contract had brought a stranger into his home. The danger was that she was already beginning to make it feel inhabited. 3 weeks into the marriage, Naomi Carter did something no one inside Whitmore Holdings had ever dared to do. She walked into a room full of people who had already decided what mattered and made them notice what they had missed. It happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon at the Whitmore Foundation offices, 10 floors below the executive suites, where polished donors like to speak about impact in rooms with catered lunches and filtered light. Naomi had been reviewing scholarship applications for an upcoming benefit dinner, learning the names behind the numbers because she refused to treat lives like a presentation deck. That was how she saw the letter. It had been misplaced in a stack marked deferred, handwritten on lined paper, the edges worn soft from being handled too many times. The applicant was the younger sister of a former building engineer who had been dismissed from one of Adrian's commercial properties after an internal reporting error made it seem as if he had falsified maintenance records. The man had lost his job, then his health coverage, and now his sister was days away from turning down admission to Howard University because she could not cover her housing deposit. Naomi read the file twice, then a third time. By the 4th page, she had already asked the foundation coordinator for the original dismissal memo. By the 5th, she understood exactly what had happened. No fraud, no dishonesty, just a rushed executive decision made 3 layers below Adrian, signed by a vice president more concerned with quarterly optics than human consequence. Naomi could have forwarded the documents to legal and moved on. That would have been cleaner, more expected. Instead, she took the elevator upstairs and asked Adrian's assistant for 10 minutes. She received 6. Adrian was in the middle of back-to-back meetings when she entered his office, the late afternoon sun cutting long gold lines across the dark wood floor. He did not look pleased to be interrupted, but he dismissed the remaining executive with one glance the moment he saw the file in Naomi's hand. "This must be important," he said once the door closed. Naomi placed the folder on his desk. "It is, unless fairness has become optional in your company." Adrian leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "That is an expensive opening sentence. Then it should have your full attention." He opened the file. She watched him read in silence, watched the shift happen almost imperceptibly in his face as the facts arranged themselves into something ugly and familiar. Power used carelessly, damage hidden under procedure. The scholarship committee marked the application deferred because of unstable household income, Naomi said. The household income became unstable because your company removed the one person supporting it. Adrian kept reading. The termination was signed at regional level. "Your name is on the building," Naomi replied. "That usually means responsibility travels up as easily as prestige does." For a moment, he said nothing. The city moved behind him in reflections of steel and glass, but the room itself felt still. Naomi did not fill the silence. She had learned by then that Adrian only respected what could survive quiet. Finally, he closed the file. "What do you want done?" The question mattered less than the fact that he asked it without defensiveness. Naomi folded her hands loosely in front of her. "Reinstate the engineer if the review confirms what this file suggests. Restore the lost benefits if legal allows it. Approve the scholarship today. And make sure the young woman never knows she was almost punished for someone else's haste." Adrian studied her for a long second, not like a husband, not even like a businessman assessing leverage, but like a man staring at a truth that had arrived without invitation. "You already decided the right answer before coming in here," he said. Naomi met his gaze. "I decided the human answer. You can decide whether your company is still capable of one." He almost smiled then, but it faded before it fully formed. "Stay," he said, pressing the intercom for his chief of staff. "You should hear how this is handled." 40 minutes later, after 2 calls, 1 review order, and 1 very uncomfortable regional vice president, the scholarship was approved and the employment file flagged for correction. When Naomi rose to leave, Adrian stood as well. "You could have gone through the foundation office," he said. "I know. Why did you come to me?" Naomi paused at the door, one hand resting lightly on the brass handle. "Because everyone else in this building is afraid of your power," she said. "I wanted to see whether you were." Then she left him there with a closed door, a changed file, and a feeling he did not have a name for yet. That night at dinner, the table between them felt shorter than it had the week before. Adrian asked how the foundation event planning was going, and Naomi answered without suspicion, as if the question did not carry more weight than it should have. But later, long after the staff had cleared the plates and the city lights had softened into midnight, Adrian stood alone in his office at the penthouse and realized the first crack in the wall around him had not come from desire or loneliness. It had come from watching a woman use compassion with the same precision he used power, and somehow making her version look stronger. By the beginning of May, their public calendar had become crowded enough to look convincing and private enough to remain dangerous. They attended a museum board dinner on Thursday, a foundation luncheon on Saturday, and a rooftop charity reception the following Tuesday where the skyline looked close enough to touch and everyone in attendance seemed trained to pretend they were not watching the Whitmores too carefully. At each event, Adrian and Naomi performed exactly what the contract required. He offered his arm when cameras were near. She stood at his side with quiet confidence that never looked rehearsed. They spoke when spoken to, smiled when necessary, and left before gossip could grow teeth. It should have remained mechanical. Instead, something almost imperceptible had begun to shift in the spaces between the required moments. Adrian started slowing his pace to match hers without thinking about it. Naomi began handing him details he had missed before donor meetings, not to impress him, but because she noticed what mattered. Once, during a benefit rehearsal, she adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo because the fold had caught wrong against his watch. Her fingers barely touched him. Even so, Adrian forgot the next sentence in the conversation and had to ask a senator's wife to repeat herself. Naomi pretended not to notice. He was beginning to understand that her kindness was never careless. It had edges. It chose where to land. The real change came on a Friday night when a storm rolled over the city hard enough to rattle the glass and erase Central Park behind a sheet of rain. Adrian returned later than usual, shoulders tight from a board meeting that had stretched past 9 and a call with London that should have ended 2 arguments and instead started 3 more. The private elevator opened into the penthouse in near darkness. Only the kitchen lights were on, soft and warm against the stone counters. Naomi stood barefoot at the island in a gray sweater, sleeves pushed to her forearms, a kettle whispering on the stove. She looked up as he stepped out, and for one strange second the room felt less like a residence and more like somewhere a man was expected. Power flickered twice, she said. Evelyn sent the staff home early before the weather got worse. Adrian loosened his tie. You stayed. Naomi poured hot water into 2 mugs. I did not think the city would forgive me if its most efficient billionaire starved during a thunderstorm. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. She handed him a mug. Chamomile, not coffee. He raised an eyebrow. You assume I need calming down? Naomi leaned one hip lightly against the counter. I assume if you wanted caffeine at 10:30, you would already have asked for it. The storm knocked once against the windows, low and steady, while somewhere in the apartment jazz drifted softly from hidden speakers. Adrian took the mug and realized, with a discomfort he could not explain, that she had learned him. Not the polished version seen in boardrooms and interviews. The real one. The man who skipped meals, who slept in fragments, who respected precision because it kept life from becoming unpredictable. They sat in the living room not because either of them suggested it directly, but because the weather made movement feel unnecessary. Naomi tucked one leg beneath her on the sofa, her mug warming both hands. Adrian sat across from her at first, then, after some unspoken adjustment in the room, moved to the other end of the same sofa with the distance between them polite enough to deny and small enough to matter. For a while they listened to rain strike glass 70 stories above the street. Did you always want this life? Adrian asked finally, the question leaving him before he had decided whether it should. Naomi looked out toward the storm. No, she said. I wanted stability. That is different. He turned the mug slowly in his hand. And did you get it? She gave a soft smile that carried no bitterness, only honesty. Some days I got responsibility wearing expensive shoes. Adrian glanced at her then, more directly than he usually allowed himself to. You say things no one around me says. That is because no one around you gets rewarded for honesty. The line should have challenged him. Instead, it settled somewhere deeper. Thunder moved farther downtown, the storm beginning to break apart. Naomi spoke again, quieter this time. What made you decide love was not worth the risk? Adrian stared at the rain-dark city for so long, she could have assumed he would not answer. He almost did not. But the apartment was dim, the hour was late, and Naomi had a way of making silence feel less like a defense and more like a doorway. Because I watch what happens when people confuse devotion with surrender, he said. And because once you have seen someone use affection as leverage, you stop mistaking warmth for safety. Naomi did not rush to comfort him. She did not say that. Not everyone was the same. She simply absorbed the truth and treated it carefully. That sounds lonely, she said. Adrian looked down at the untouched ring of steam above his mug. It was efficient. Naomi turned toward him fully then, not close enough to threaten the careful balance between them, but close enough that he could feel the attention in her silence. Those are not the same thing. He met her eyes, and there it was again, that dangerous stillness, that sense that nothing visible had happened, and yet something essential had moved. Neither of them looked away. Neither of them crossed the final inch into recklessness. But when Naomi stood to take their mugs back to the kitchen, her shoulder brushed his sleeve in the most accidental way possible, and Adrian sat very still after she was gone, watching the storm fade over Manhattan and understanding, for the first time, that the most fragile moments in a life were not always loud. Sometimes they arrived quietly, in lamplight and rain, with a woman who asked honest questions and made a man answer them. By early June, the city had started wearing summer like a polished performance. Terraces reopened. Town cars idled longer outside hotels. Names that mattered moved through Manhattan in linen, silk, and strategy. Naomi had grown used to the rhythm of the Whitmore world by then, though she never quite belonged to it in the way the others did. She belonged to herself. That was precisely why people remembered her. And it was why the trouble, when it arrived, did not come through the front door with noise. It came the way most dangerous things did in Adrian's world. Beautifully dressed and perfectly timed. Her name was Celeste Monroe. Naomi heard it first from two women at a charity brunch who lowered their voices too late and assumed elegance made cruelty invisible. Celeste had once been everywhere Adrian was expected to be. Celeste had once worn Whitmore blue at a winter gala. Celeste had once been the woman the city assumed he would marry. Naomi kept her eyes on the place card in front of her and gave nothing away, but the name stayed with her long after dessert plates were cleared. That evening, when she returned to the penthouse, Adrian was already home, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading something on his tablet in the living room. The setting sun turned the windows bronze around him, making him look for one brief second less like a tycoon and more like a tired man pretending the difference did not matter. Naomi set her bag down on the console table. "Who is Celeste Monroe?" she asked. Adrian looked up immediately, not startled, just still. That alone told her enough. He placed the tablet aside with careful precision. "Someone from my past." Naomi waited. He did not rush to fill the silence. "That sounds like a sentence people use when the details are inconvenient," she said. Adrian exhaled once, slow. "She and I were involved for a time. It ended years ago. And now she is irrelevant." The answer should have settled it. Instead, it sounded too controlled, too exact, like language chosen for damage management rather than truth. Naomi nodded once and turned toward the hallway before her expression could become anything more revealing than composure. "Good," she said. "Then I suppose it will remain that way." But it did not. 3 days later, Celeste Monroe appeared at a private reception for a hospital wing bearing the Whitmore name, wearing a white dress that was too close to bridal for coincidence and a smile sharpened by history. She crossed the room as though she had every right to still be there. Adrian saw her before Naomi did. Something in his posture changed immediately, not warmth, not longing, but recognition laced with caution. Naomi noticed because she had learned him well enough to read the smallest alterations. Celeste greeted him with the ease of someone familiar with his habits, then turned to Naomi with polished curiosity. "So you are the wife?" she said. Naomi held her gaze and offered the kind of smile that protected dignity better than confrontation ever could. "That is usually how marriage works." Celeste's laugh was soft and expensive. Adrian was never meant for domesticity. Adrian's expression hardened. "Celeste." One word. A warning. But warnings, Naomi was beginning to understand, rarely arrived in time to prevent harm. Later that night, after the event, she passed Adrian's study and heard voices through the half-closed door. She had not meant to stop. She stopped anyway. Celeste's tone was lower now, stripped of public polish. "You really expect me to believe this is real?" she asked. Adrian's answer came flat and tired. "What I expect is for you to leave my home and stop manufacturing relevance out of old history." "Old history," Celeste replied. "You were ready to build a future once." Silence. Then Adrian again, quieter. "That was before I understood what it cost." Naomi stood motionless in the hallway, one hand tightening around the folder she had been carrying from the foundation office. "That was before I understood what it cost." She did not hear the rest clearly after that. The blood in her ears was louder than the voices behind the door. She did not know whether he meant Celeste, love, trust, or the arrangement he had made with Naomi herself. But standing there in the elegant hush of a penthouse that still did not fully feel like hers, one truth landed with brutal simplicity. She had begun to forget this marriage had an expiration date. He had not. The next morning, Adrian was gone before sunrise for a call with Singapore and a breakfast meeting at the office. Naomi sat alone at the long dining table with untouched coffee growing cold beside her, staring at the ring on her left hand as if it belonged to someone more foolish. By noon, gossip had already found oxygen. A photo of Adrian and Celeste speaking at the hospital reception appeared online beneath a headline careful enough to avoid legal trouble and cruel enough to do damage anyway. Former flame returns. Questions around the Whitmore marriage. Naomi read exactly 3 lines before setting her phone face down. When Adrian called that afternoon, she let it go to voicemail. When his assistant emailed to confirm their attendance at a dinner the following evening, she replied with one sentence. "Mrs. Whitmore will not be available." That night, Adrian came home to find the penthouse lit but silent, dinner untouched, and Naomi standing by the east windows in the dark, looking over a city that suddenly felt much farther away than 70 floors. Adrian did not turn on the lights when he entered the room. He did not need them. The shape of Naomi by the east windows was enough to tell him everything had already changed. Manhattan burned below them in ribbons of white and amber, the city moving with its usual confidence. But inside the penthouse the silence felt brittle, like something one wrong sentence could shatter. Naomi kept her eyes on the glass. Her reflection floated over the skyline, elegant and distant, one hand resting lightly against her opposite wrist, as if she were holding herself steady without wanting him to see it. Adrian set his keys on the console with deliberate care. "You did not answer my calls." Naomi gave a small nod, not unkind, just resolved. "I know." He took a step closer. "Then answer me now." That made her turn. Her face was calm, which Adrian had already learned was more dangerous than anger. Anger argued. Calm concluded. "What exactly would you like me to answer?" she asked. "Whether tonight is about headlines, Celeste, or the fact that you heard something out of context and decided not to ask me the rest." Adrian's voice remained even, but only because years of control had taught it to. Naomi studied him for a second that felt longer than it should have. "Out of context," she repeated softly. "That is interesting, because context is usually the first thing men in your world control." Adrian exhaled through his nose and ran a hand across the back of his neck, a rare sign that strain had reached the surface. Celeste came to provoke a reaction. "She got one. That is all." Naomi looked down at the ring on her left hand, then back up. "No, that is not all." She crossed the room with measured steps, stopping at the dining table where a cream envelope rested beside a silver pen. Adrian had not noticed it before. Now he did, and the sight of it produced a hard, immediate stillness in him. Naomi touched the edge of the envelope, but did not hand it over yet. "I knew what this marriage was when I agreed to it," she said. "I knew it was a contract, a strategy, a solution designed by people who speak in percentages and social optics. I accepted that because I believed I could move through it with my dignity intact." Adrian's jaw tightened. "And you have." Naomi gave him a look so steady it made the room feel smaller. "Have I?" She slid the envelope across the table. "Because the city sees your former lover walk into a reception, stand too close, and speak as if I am temporary. The press sees enough to speculate. Your board sees enough to stay quiet. And I stand there wearing your last name, trying not to realize I am the only person in the room who forgot this arrangement had an ending." Adrian did not touch the envelope. "Naomi." Just her name. Lower now. More human than he intended. She opened the flap herself and removed a thin stack of papers. The termination addendum. Cleanly prepared. Signed on her side. "I asked one of the attorneys to draft this last month," she said. "I never thought I would use it." Something in Adrian's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough for Naomi to see that the blow had landed. "Last month?" he asked. "Why?" "Because somewhere between charity dinners and coffee in the kitchen and storms that made this place feel less empty, I made the mistake of thinking something real might exist here." Her voice never cracked. That was the cruelest part. "I needed a way out before hope became humiliation." Adrian stared at the papers as if they were written in a language he had once mastered and suddenly could not read. "This is not necessary." Naomi's smile was faint and tired and far too gracious for the moment. "It is the first necessary thing I have done for myself in weeks." She removed the ring slowly, setting it on top of the signed pages with a soft sound that seemed to echo anyway. Adrian looked at it, then at her hand without it, and the sight unsettled him more than any boardroom crisis ever had. "You are leaving tonight?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "My things are already packed. I will stay at the apartment the foundation keeps for visiting fellows until I make other arrangements." He moved then, only one step, but enough to break the frozen distance between them. "Naomi, listen to me. Celeste means nothing." Naomi met his eyes, and for the first time since he had known her, the gentleness in her expression was not warmth. It was farewell. "That is not the problem," she said. "The problem is that I am beginning to mean something, and you still speak about all of this like it can be managed." She picked up her overnight bag from beside the chair where he had not noticed it waiting, then walked past him toward the private elevator. Adrian did not reach for her. Perhaps he did not know how. Perhaps men who built their lives on control never learned what to do when the most important thing in the room chose to leave quietly. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Naomi stepped inside, then looked up once more, not with bitterness, not even with accusation, but with the kind of sorrow that only appears when respect remains and hope does not. "Take care of yourself, Adrian," she said. Then the doors closed, and for the first time in years, the penthouse was exactly as he had once wanted it to be. Silent, ordered, untouched, and unbearably empty. The next morning, Adrian Whitmore arrived at his office before 6:30 and discovered that success, when stripped of the person who had made it feel human, was a remarkably hollow thing. The executive floor was silent except for the muted hum of climate control and the soft click of his shoes against stone. His assistant had already forwarded the day's priorities to his tablet. Singapore follow-up, board strategy call, merger review, investor luncheon. Every item on the schedule belonged to the version of Adrian Whitmore the world understood. Efficient, precise, untouched by personal error. He read the first briefing note twice without absorbing a word. Then he set the tablet down, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and unfolded the termination addendum Naomi had left on the dining table. The paper was crisp. Her signature was steady. No drama in the ink. No appeal hidden between the lines. Just dignity, preserved exactly the way she had promised herself it would be. Adrian stared at it long enough to understand something that should have been obvious sooner. Naomi had not left to punish him. She had left because staying had begun to cost her self-respect. That realization stayed with him through the entire morning, sharpening everything he had failed to see while he still had the luxury of her presence. At 9 o'clock, he sat through a board meeting in a room lined with views and inherited confidence while 3 directors debated timing on the merger announcement, and one asked, with carefully neutral phrasing, whether the current speculation around his marriage required a communications adjustment. Adrian looked at the polished walnut table, the legal pads, the pens aligned near water glasses, and felt something in him go cold in an entirely new way. Not defensive, clear. "There will be no adjustment," he said, "because there will be no performance." The chairman frowned slightly. "Adrian, the market appreciates continuity." Adrian folded his hands. "The market does not get to dictate my private life." A silence followed, not shocked exactly, but alert. The board was accustomed to his authority. They were less accustomed to his defiance when it threatened strategy. "With respect," another director said, "the image of a stable marriage has materially strengthened the merger climate." Adrian turned his head just enough to meet the man's eyes. "Then perhaps the merger climate was weaker than I was led to believe." By noon, he had postponed the investor luncheon, canceled a non-essential media appearance, and instructed legal to pause every step related to the termination papers Naomi had signed. Not reject them, not destroy them, pause them. He had no right to make choices for her anymore. But he was finished letting other people turn her into a useful line item in their plans. At 1:30, his chief of staff entered with a final packet for the evening event, a citywide philanthropy awards ceremony at the plaza where Naomi was scheduled to receive recognition for her work restructuring the Whitmore Foundation Scholarship Program. Adrian looked up sharply. "She kept the appearance?" "It is not a Whitmore event," the chief of staff said carefully. "It is her award." For the first time all day, something like breath returned to Adrian's chest. Naomi had not disappeared. She had returned to herself. By 7 that evening, the ballroom at the plaza was all light and polished brass. Old New York elegance arranged to honor people who usually changed lives without asking to be seen while doing it. Naomi stood near the front of the room in deep sapphire, not because the color demanded attention, but because it held it anyway. She looked composed, self-contained, and entirely separate from him. That was the part Adrian felt most sharply. She had once stood at his side because a contract required it. Tonight she stood alone because her own work had earned the space. When her name was announced, the applause was immediate and sincere. Naomi walked to the stage with the same calm she brought into every room that underestimated her. She accepted the Glass Award, thanked the foundation partners, and spoke briefly about access, fairness, and what it means when institutions remember the human lives hidden behind administrative decisions. Adrian listened from the back of the ballroom and realized that every room Naomi entered became more honest because she was in it. Then the MC invited one of the principal sponsors to join the stage for a remarks segment tied to the upcoming Whitmore merger announcement. Adrian had known about the segment. What no one else knew was that he had decided, in the 15 minutes between leaving his car and entering the ballroom, that the life he wanted could no longer be built on convenience dressed as caution. He walked to the stage under a wash of polite applause, accepted the microphone, and looked not at the crowd but at Naomi. Her expression shifted only slightly when she saw him there. Surprise first, then wariness. She had every reason for both. Adrian turned to the audience of donors, executives, reporters, and board members who now sensed something unscripted was happening. For years, he said, his voice carrying with the easy control of a man used to commanding rooms, I believed distance was strength. I believed the safest promises were the ones that kept people far enough away to never matter. The ballroom went still. Somewhere near the front, a camera flash sparked and faded. Adrian did not look away from Naomi. I was wrong. A murmur moved through the room. He continued before anyone could interrupt the truth with interpretation. This city has spent months discussing my marriage as if it were strategy, speculation, or social theater. That ends tonight. Naomi Carter Whitmore did not enter my life to improve my reputation. She improved my character. She brought humanity into rooms where people had mistaken efficiency for wisdom. She reminded me that dignity is not decorative. It is the standard. Naomi stood motionless, the award still in her hands, her eyes fixed on him with the kind of stunned restraint that made every word feel heavier. Adrian's board members looked horrified. Reporters looked delighted. He no longer cared which reaction arrived first. There is a merger announcement I was expected to support tonight, he said. I will not be making it. There are board members who will consider that reckless. They can. But there is only one reckless choice I regret, and that was allowing a woman I respect more than anyone in this room to believe she was temporary in my life. The silence that followed was no longer polite. It was electric. Adrian stepped down from the formal podium and crossed the distance toward Naomi in full view of the city that had always preferred its power polished and emotionally mute. When he stopped before her, his voice dropped, but the microphone still carried every word. You told me the problem was that you were beginning to mean something while I kept speaking as if everything could be managed, he said. You were right. I tried to manage what I should have honored. I tried to classify what I should have chosen. Naomi's breath caught so faintly most people would have missed it. Adrian did not. I cannot ask you to forgive me, because forgiveness is not another contract clause I get to negotiate, he said. But I can tell the truth in front of every person who once benefited from my silence. I love you. And for the first time in my life, that does not feel like weakness. It feels like the only honest thing I have ever said. For a long moment after Adrian's confession, the ballroom forgot how to breathe. Naomi stood beneath the stage lights with the glass award in her hands, and the full weight of his words settling somewhere far deeper than surprise. Around them, Manhattan's most polished voices remained silent, not out of courtesy, but because truth had entered the room without permission and left no graceful place to hide. Adrian did not move closer. He did not reach for her, as if emotion entitled him to her forgiveness. He simply stood there, a man who had built an empire on certainty, now waiting in public for an answer he had no power to command. Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she had never seen before. Not control, not calculation, humility. It changed the air between them. She lowered her eyes for 1 second, then lifted them again with the calm that had always been hers, even when her heart had been asked to survive more than it should. You finally said something without a contract behind it, she said softly. A few people in the audience smiled in disbelief, the tension in the room shifting into something warmer, more human. Adrian let out the smallest breath, almost unsteady. I should have done it sooner. Naomi's gaze held his. Yes, she said, and there was honesty in that too. Then, after a pause that seemed to restore dignity to every wound that had come before it, she added, but sooner would have given you the right words. I needed to see whether you could become the right man. The line landed gently, but Adrian felt it all the same. It was not punishment. It was truth with its shoulders back. Naomi set the award on the podium beside her and stepped down from the stage. The room watched as she came to stand in front of him, not above him, not below him, but exactly where she had always belonged. Equal. I am not interested in grand gestures for headlines, she said quietly, though the microphone still carried enough for the room to hear. I am not interested in being rescued in public after being doubted in private. And I am not interested in staying in any life where I have to wonder whether I am a person or a strategy. Adrian nodded once, every inch of him attentive. You will never wonder that again. Naomi studied him for another second, measuring not the sentence, but the man beneath it. Then she reached up, not for his hand, but for the microphone still lowered at his side, and gently eased it away from both of them. Good, she said. Then let the rest of this be ours. The room, perhaps sensing that some things should not be consumed like entertainment, softened into respectful applause as the event staff moved quickly and discreetly to guide the program forward. By the next morning, every paper in the city carried a version of the story. Billionaire pauses merger. Public declaration stuns Manhattan. Foundation leader at center of Whitmore reversal. The headlines were dramatic because headlines always were. But for Adrian and Naomi, the change began in quieter places. He withdrew from the merger vote, forcing the board to reckon with how much of their strategy had depended on managing his image rather than respecting his judgment. He removed 2 directors whose loyalty had always bent toward convenience. He corrected every legal document tied to the marriage without making a single move Naomi had not agreed to first. And when he asked to see her again, he did not send a car. He called himself. Naomi met him 2 days later in the conservatory garden at the New York Botanical Garden, a place far from cameras and polished speculation. The morning was clear, the air warm but not heavy, and sunlight moved through the glass above them in soft squares of gold. Adrian arrived early. Naomi noticed that immediately. Men like him were rarely early unless the moment mattered. He was holding no ring box, no prepared speech, no legal envelope. Just a folded piece of paper. What is that? She asked when she reached him. Adrian gave a small, almost self-conscious smile. The original contract. Naomi raised one eyebrow. You brought paperwork to a garden? Only so I could do this. He tore the document cleanly in half, then in half again, and placed the pieces into a recycling bin beside the bench with more reverence than destruction. Naomi watched him, and for the first time in many days, her smile arrived without effort. That is a very expensive symbolic gesture, she said. I am trying to learn your language, Adrian replied. She looked at him, then with the quiet warmth that had once entered his home and made it feel inhabited. And what language is that? Adrian took one careful step closer. The one where dignity comes before possession. The one where love is proven in consistency, not control. The one where a woman should never have to leave in order to be valued. Naomi's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. You have learned something. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket then, and Naomi's breath caught. But what he brought out was not the platinum ring from their wedding day. It was a simple gold band. Unadorned. Elegant. Human. The first ring belonged to an arrangement, he said. This one belongs to a choice. Not because a board asked for it. Not because the city expects it. Because I do. Naomi looked at the ring, then back at him. And if I say no? Adrian answered without hesitation. Then I will still spend the rest of my life grateful that you taught me how to become a man capable of asking honestly. It was that answer, more than the ring, more than the skyline, more than the newspapers still buzzing with his public confession, that finally broke the last of the distance between them. Naomi stepped closer until only the smallest breath remained. Then yes, she said. But this time, there will be no clauses. Adrian's smile came slowly, like something earned rather than owned. No clauses, he agreed. Their second wedding took place 3 weeks later in the garden of a restored estate in Westchester, under white roses and late June light, with fewer than 30 guests and not a single camera invited. Evelyn attended. So did the reinstated building engineer and his younger sister, now preparing for her first semester at Howard. Naomi wore ivory again, not to repeat the past, but to reclaim it. Adrian wore a dark suit and none of the armor he used to mistake for strength. When they spoke their vows, they were simple enough to be remembered and true enough to last. He promised to choose honesty before silence. She promised to protect peace without abandoning truth. And when the ceremony ended, there was no applause from strangers, no market reaction, no strategic advantage waiting at the altar. Only light, only relief. Only the quiet miracle of two people standing where fear had once ruled, building something gentler and far stronger in its place. Later that evening, after the guests had drifted toward dinner and the summer sky had begun to turn the color of fading pearls, Adrian found Naomi standing near the garden wall with her shoes in one hand and the new ring catching the last of the light. He came to stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder, the world finally small enough to fit inside one shared silence. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Naomi looked out over the lawn, where laughter rose softly from the reception tent. "That the first time I married you, it felt like entering a house with locked doors," she said. Then she turned toward him, her expression calm and luminous and fully certain. "This time," she added, "it feels like coming home." Adrian said nothing for a moment because some endings were too sacred to hurry. Then he took her hand, not as a claim, not as a performance, but as a promise finally worthy of her. And beneath the soft New York dusk, the man who had once believed love made people weak understood at last what it actually made possible. Not surrender, not chaos, a home.